Hello and welcome to our first in our new series of Frontline Recaps. We're looking at major events in the week around Russia and the war in Ukraine and discussing some of the Times Radio expert analysis that we've seen over the past week or so. I'm Philip Ingram. I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer and global commentator on all matters defence. So the subjects that we're going to look at today, the key events in Russia are the ceasefire ideas that are taking hold, and we're going to look at what Mark Rutte, the new NATO Sec Gen, has said. We're going to look at the Russian economy and material shortages, and Maxim Tucker has been our expert analyst this week. Have a little look at the situation on the ground in Ukraine, and former General Rupert Jones has been our commentator on that this week. And then we have to look at how Russia and Syria are coming together and the impact of what's going on in Syria is having in Russia. And so the Syria-Russia Mediterranean fleet, and looking at that is something we'll examine in a little bit more detail. So on the potential ceasefire this week, we heard from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte.
Russia's aggression shows no sign of abating. Just the opposite. Putin is ramping up his rhetoric and reckless actions. He is using Ukraine as a testing ground for experimental missiles and is deploying North Korean soldiers in this illegal war. But we will all need to do more, especially now. The stronger our military support to Ukraine is now, the stronger their hand will be at the negotiating table. And the sooner we can end Russian aggression once and for all in Ukraine. Tomorrow, ministers will address Russia's hostile actions in NATO countries. Over the past years, Russia and also China have tried to destabilize our nations with acts of sabotage, cyber attacks, and energy blackmail to intimidate us. None of these actions will deter us from supporting Ukraine or making our own defenses stronger. NATO allies will continue to stand together to face these threats through a range of measures, including greater intelligence sharing and better protection of our critical infrastructure. Let me be very firm on this, and here I will quote Zelensky end of February 2022, when some countries offered him a plane to bring him into safety in Poland, and he said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." I would now argue that Ukraine doesn't need more ideas on what a peace process could look like, and you and I can sit together and drink a cup of coffee and we can think of many ways how to deal with a peace process whenever that starts. But I would argue, let's not have all these discussions step by step on what a peace process might look like. Make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to get to a position of strength when those peace talks start, when the Ukrainian government has decided they are ready to do so.
So, what Mark Rutte has effectively said is he's reflected the comments that came out from Ukrainian President Zelensky, where it's recognizing that this conflict is going to come and only going to finish whenever both sides get down and start to negotiate. President Zelensky has turned around and said that he is willing to offer some of the territory that Russia has captured already and put that into one basket, provided the rest of Ukraine is admitted to NATO as a full member. That is a level of concession that was reflected in what Mark Rutte was talking about when it comes to the end of every conflict is by negotiation only. We have to remember that war is diplomacy by other means. It will only ever finish whenever both sides get down around a table and talk and come up with some form of agreement. The fighting element of war is about setting the conditions to force one side or the other to capitulate to enough point so that they can get around the table, or to get both sides to what in military terms is called the culminating point, which is where neither side can maneuver anymore and you have to look at another way out of things and you sit down and discuss. I think all of this is really just in preparation and all of this is, dare I be irreverent, a little bit of diplomatic noise being aimed at Donald Trump. President Zelensky is playing a very serious game with Trump's team by showing that he is willing to negotiate and compromise, knowing full well that Vladimir Putin won't. and Trump will be put in a position where he has to support either Putin in not compromising or Zelensky in offering to compromise. And I think Trump will come down on Zelensky's side. Mark Rutte with NATO is remembering what Donald Trump did when he was president beforehand and threatened NATO, threatened to withdraw from NATO, and threatened not to support Article 5 operations. Article 5, for those that don't know, are effectively an attack on one is considered an attack on all. NATO cannot survive and cannot prosecute military operations without US support. So this is critical. And I think this was Mark Rutte, the new Secretary General for NATO, laying out the conditions to suggest that NATO would be in a position to help any ceasefire negotiations and set the conditions for that in the future, trying to push off any Trump anger or pressure on NATO to do more in contributing to dealing with the Ukraine-Russian war. But I think what Mark Rutte is saying and what President Zelensky is saying is there's a little bit of a difference between them in that what the pressure that Trump will put on Rutte and on NATO will be to take a greater lead in dealing with what's going on inside Ukraine. And that greater lead is purely because there are three potential conflicts around the world. We've got Europe with Russia, Ukraine. We've got the Middle East, and that's expanding as we're seeing in Syria. And we've got the potential in Southeast Asia with the pressure that China's putting on Taiwan and the growth of military capability. And in particular, what we describe in military terms as power projection capability in Southeast Asia. And Trump will be concerned that America cannot take on all responsibility for all three conflict or potential conflict zones and will want NATO, and in particular the European side of NATO, to step up and take greater responsibility for what's going on inside inside Ukraine with Russia's influence into there. And I think we will see Trump trying to put additional pressure on NATO and on the European elements of NATO to take that responsibility so that America doesn't withdraw its support but can take a step back. And the European members of NATO have stepped up their production from their defence industrial bases. They've got greater equipment outputs. They can provide that support to Ukraine with a little bit of US help, but that'll give the US a little bit of leeway and a little bit of breathing space to deal with the conflicts elsewhere. Of course, we're seeing the UK, France, Italy saying that they will deploy their carrier groups to Southeast Asia in 2025 to try and take some of the pressure off the US carrier groups and the US activities in Southeast Asia to try and keep a lid on what's going on from China and other areas that's there. This is where we're seeing an expansion of NATO's responsibility, not just from the North Atlantic, but to NATO's areas of interest, which include Southeast Asia. So it's, at the moment, a global issue that we're looking at. Let's hope this doesn't turn into a global conflict. So on the economy and sanctions, Maxim Tucker on Frontline had some very good points to say this week.
Well, we can see that the ruble is obviously skyrocketing at the moment, but it's, the Russian economy is so heavily manipulated by the state, by the Kremlin, that they're trying to protect it from damage and trying to demonstrate confidence in the Russian market, and they manipulate the information space in order to do that as well. So it's difficult to gain a sense, really, without being inside the Kremlin, of like how badly this is affecting Russia. There are signs of an economy that's creaking, that's struggling under strain, and I think the West should be prepared to maintain tight sanctions on Russia as long as Russian troops are on Ukrainian soil. So any ceasefire agreement must not see the lifting of sanctions, and that will, I think, ultimately be the thing that encourages Russia to look for a way out, of the conflict in Ukraine. That does involve them withdrawing troops from Ukrainian territory, because it's the economic sanctions that will bite in the long term and will hurt Russia and will destabilize Putin's regime. So if there is a ceasefire that would involve any lifting of sanctions on Russia or ending the economic isolation of Russia, then that would allow Putin just to regather and to regroup and to come back again. Like we've seen since 2014, so many broken ceasefires in Ukraine. Obviously not to the scale until 2022, but the Ukrainians have learned not to trust the Russians when it comes to ceasefire because they've just violated the terms of agreements again and again and again. And so there's a lot of pessimism about whether they can trust it this time around. And this is why Zelensky is so adamant about saying we need something like membership of NATO to make sure that if there is a ceasefire agreement and if Russia again violates that and again invades Ukraine, then there will be a NATO response to it, and there will be kind of NATO troops on the ground, NATO, air police missions, things like this, that could stop the Russians rather than just more weapons and more talking. So they're very worried that sanctions might be lifted, particularly because obviously Trump is business focused and he has long had money interests coming from Russia. There is people around him that desperately for years have wanted to lift sanctions on Russia and get trade with Russia flowing again and get those petrodollars into their pockets again. So this is what Ukraine is really worried about, that could happen, that a ceasefire that would lift the isolation of Russia and normalize the situation, just allow Russia to rebuild, regroup, and then come back for Ukraine. And that would be dangerous for NATO and the West as well, because I think an emboldened, stronger Russia that's got away with this again would think about threatening NATO territory, maybe taking a small piece of Estonia, sitting there waiting to see what the NATO reaction is, hoping that they can break NATO by demonstrating that it doesn't respond to Article 5 threats.
Now, when we look at what Maxim has said and we look at the Russian economy, this is critical because the conflict is going to end because the strategic conditions have been set for both Putin and Zelensky to have to sit down around the table. It's not going to be a decisive activity because of what's going on in the tactical battle. It's more likely to be something that's strategic, based around the economy, as Maxim has suggested. And if we look at the Russian economy, this year, on paper, 4% growth. That's significantly better than many European nations, or 4.1% to be accurate. But this has come out from Vladimir Putin's comments, and that was as at October this year. Most of that growth is because of increases in output from Russian manufacturing and the way they calculate the growth. That Russian manufacturing is because the Russian economy is in a war footing and relying on Russian domestic manufacturing output. And many of the industries have gone on to a 24/7 footing, a war footing, almost a total war footing in output terms. And that's what's giving the Russian economy this economic growth that we're seeing. The other bit that's a positive statistic for Russia, if we compare it to the wider European and international statistics, is that unemployment in Russia is only 2.3%. But we have to ask ourselves why. It's only 2.3% because most of those that were unemployed, most of those that are not serving industry or part of the manufacturing industry delivering that 4% growth, are fighting in Ukraine. So it's an artificial figure. So critical to Vladimir Putin's position in the world is his relationship with his international supporters. Of course, he's part of the BRICS community, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. There's a lot more members than that, but that is key to his international stability. And we're seeing Vladimir Putin then taking every opportunity to discuss Russia's position from a geopolitical perspective and trying to suggest that Russia is still an international player. And we can see Putin now talking to a forum called Russia Calling.
I'm also speaking about the work on the investment platform that we are implementing with our colleagues in BRICS. We're starting to implement this work. And all our colleagues have agreed that it is a very interesting and useful work for everyone that has good prospects. It will be an instrument to support our economies, to ensure financial resources for the countries of the Global South and East. The advanced development of information technologies that is being demonstrated by Russia, our cutting-edge solutions in financial sphere, will be a major contribution to the development of this platform.
And you know that our inflation has risen slightly at 8.8, and now it has increased versus last year. It was at 7.5, now it's 8.8. This is why the central bank had to raise the policy rate up to 21%. We hear lots of criticism saying that that would subvert and suppress development. Other experts believe it's inevitable, and some people say that 21% of the policy rate versus 8.8% of inflation is too big a difference. I will not give any assessments whether it's good or bad, but I just want to say that there are some difficulties for the real sector. It's fraught with some difficulties for the real sector. And, those people who don't have accounts at banks experience a great deal of a burden because of the inflation. These are the lower income strata of the society and brackets of the society. So the prices keep growing, but these people don't have deposits and they don't receive any additional incomes. And probably there are lots of such people, or the majority of these people, versus those who have deposits. And we should think it over also now with respect to the production part.
When we start to look at the real statistics that are suggesting where the Russian economy is going, well, we look at the interest rates. It's at a record level of 21% at the moment. Inflation is at a record level of 9% and just going up. The ruble is at its lowest point in compared to the dollar at 114 ruble to the US dollar. That impacts the currency generation that Russia can get from its primary export. Its exports used to be, its defense exports used to be very large around the world. It can't afford to export defense around the world. And in fact, the lessons that are coming out of the war with Ukraine is that Russian military equipment is not as good as the Russians have tried to sell it as in the past. So we're getting the likes of India, which was a major consumer of Russian military capability, now looking to Western companies to rearm through them. So the Russian defense export industry has effectively died. Where they get most of their money from at the moment is through the export of oil. Oil to China, about 47% of Russian oil goes to China. India takes about 37%. Interestingly, the EU takes 6% and Turkey takes 6%. Into the wider BRICS community, there's quite a good percentage going into those different countries as well. And therefore, whenever the international oil price is high, and that's what Putin wants, then he's getting a net income to help him fund his war in Ukraine and trying to improve Russian economic statistics. But whenever that price is low and the ruble to the dollar price is low, that is affecting Russia economically quite severely. So that international oil price is critical. And I think what we're likely to see when President Trump comes in is a set of series of conditions to bring the international oil prices down as low as possible, because he knows that that will hurt Vladimir Putin, and it will get Putin to a point where he can't afford to continue the war. The Russian economy will become closer and closer and closer to collapsing completely. And that's when we'll see a proper end to the conflict in Ukraine. 2025 economically in Russia, as we heard from Tucker, is going to be a fascinating year. And of course, we know that the war on the ground is still ongoing, and casualties and the fighting is severe. Casualties are significant. And here's some analysis from former General Rupert Jones with Frontline earlier on this week.
Yeah, I mean, I think the danger is, isn't it, that we, because this war's been going on for such a long time, that we understand, we kind of fixate on a small tactical gain here and a small tactical gain there. And it's important to kind of step back a little bit to see what that is all adding up to. And I think the first thing I'd say is although, almost in counter to my own comment, we should never underestimate day in, day out, just how bloody and brutal this war is. There's suggestions that Russian casualty levels are almost at an all-time high at the moment, even when it appears that there's not that much going on in macro terms. When you zone right in, there's really brutal, bloody fighting going on. And whilst the Ukrainians are imposing very significant casualties on the Russians, it is coming at significant pain to them, both in terms of casualties, but also, as we know, the Ukrainian military are just tired. They're tired as a nation, understandably. They're tired as a military institution. Get right down to the ground level. Individual soldiers are quite understandably very, very tired. So, what do I think is as we kind of have a strategic conversation, if you like, as we look out towards the new year and Trump coming in and if you like, the posturing that is going on now between the United States with Russia, with Ukraine at that political level, it seemed to me the most important play down at tactical level, to come right back to your question, is what's going on in Kursk. Because movements on the front line inside Ukraine are tactically significant, of course. They're hugely significant to the soldiers fighting over that ground. They're significant to the people whose homes, villages are being gained or lost. But as we look to a strategic conversation, what really matters is that foothold in Kursk that we've talked about before, because that is one of Zelensky's key cards he can play when, to some degree, the music stops and it comes about the talking rather than the fighting. Holding on as much as he can to that Kursk salient, small though it is vital. Though we continue to hear reports, quite understandably, that the Ukrainian soldiers in that salient are, they're exhausted and they're clinging on. To your point, how does this war get won or lost? It's not around, retaking a particular village or losing a particular village. It is a clash of wills. It is a clash of the Russian economy against the Ukrainian economy. The Ukrainian economy is all in. The Russian economy is clearly hurting from this. And the Vietnam analogy is interesting here, because yes, that's the great cry, isn't it? They won every engagement. Of course, they didn't, but the Americans lost the war. And it continues to worry me when people do, and I know you don't, James, but when people talk too much about casualties. We should talk about casualties, it seems to me, as a reminder of how diabolically brutal this is. But what I think we should be very cautious of doing is highlighting Russian casualty figures as being a metric by which you can point to the degree to which Russia is about to capitulate, for sake of argument, because we know from previous wars, the Great Patriotic War and things, that Russia has an extraordinary ability, resilience to absorb casualties, and I make that point because, of course, what the Americans suffered from was the body bag, the focus all about their casualties. Viet Cong casualties, and of course it doesn't add up to anything. It doesn't add up to anything because it is about a clash of wills. So kind of long way around your answer. So to some degree, it's inevitable that people fixate down on the tactical, but equally we must constantly be drawing back from that to see what does that tell us.
So Rupert's analysis is, as ever, as I would expect from him, spot on. And the critical bit for me is where he describes that the small movements that we're seeing in the front line are really insignificant when it comes to setting the conditions for the peace negotiations and when negotiations are going to happen. Negotiations are going to happen at that strategic level. It's Putin and Zelensky, but it's the influence that comes in from the United States, from NATO, and from other players around the world, including Xi Jinping in China. So this is where Trump's relationship from an international perspective is going to allow him to try and put pressure on Putin from outside and pressure on Zelensky from outside and where he can from inside. And that's the critical piece to it. The tactical fighting, as Rupert Jones said, is helping to set the conditions for those strategic negotiations, and by weakening the enemy, and that's why you have tactical fights to force them into position to negotiate, getting them to a point where they recognize that they cannot continue the fight. And if we look at what's happening in Russia, Russia is now, it's losing between 1,500 and 2,000 troops a day. I think UK Defence Intelligence has analysed that it's lost just over 1,500 troops every day for the past month at least, and over 1,400 troops a day for the past year. That is unsustainable. And that's why the Russians are relying on troops coming in from North Korea, from heavy recruiting in North Africa, where the rump of the Wagner group are working. And there's additional pressures coming in on Russian troops and Russian capability with what's happening inside Syria at the moment. We'll talk about that in a moment. But Putin is hurting. Russia is hurting. Zelensky is hurting as well, but he's got a much bigger power base with NATO and with the international community supporting him. His key area of shortage is manpower. Russia's area of shortage is manpower, ammunition, equipment, and international support. And this is what will lead to the conditions for any negotiations in 2025. So significant activity in Syria, which has got direct Russian influence. Aleppo has fallen to the rebels. Hama today, as we're filming this, has fallen to the rebels. And that is the staging point for Homs and then potentially Damascus. But of course, if the rebels decided to turn west and go out to the coast, we've got the Russian Mediterranean fleet base at Tartus. And that's what will concern the Russians. What's the Russian influence inside Syria? It's Tartus, the Mediterranean fleet base. It's the support for Bashar al-Assad, in particular Air Force support, and keeping Assad in power. Why are they doing that? Because of the strategic significance of Syria, not just for that Mediterranean fleet base, but also from an intelligence gathering perspective and a training establishment. It was always a big training area for Russian forces. Things are changing and changing rapidly. So if we look at the footage that we're getting out of Syria and the state of the trucks and the roads and the road network that's there, there's a number of differences between what is happening in Syria and what Russia is doing inside Ukraine. With Syria, we're seeing the rebel forces who are light forces, lightly equipped, moving down the main supply routes past damaged Syrian equipment. But all of that Syrian equipment is Russian. The trucks are Russian trucks. The tanks that we can see littered around the sides of the roads are Russian tanks. Some of them have clearly been operational and have either broken down, and there's not much evidence of them being destroyed, so I'd say broken down more than anything else. Some of them are clearly in positions where they have hardly ever been used. They have been static in those positions for long periods of time. But what is clear is that the Syrian army have had to abandon their equipment as the advance of the rebel forces has been so rapid. Part of that abandonment will be down to, I would suggest, reliability of the pieces of equipment. It's Russian. Russia can't supply the spare parts that are needed. Those from Middle Eastern countries are not necessarily the most reliable at maintaining their equipment and keeping it working at different times. And it's quite clear when we look at the trucks themselves that there has been some engagement with fighting forces, but in military terms they're called B vehicles, trucks transporting goods. They're not designed to fight. Those are the ones that we're seeing damaged. When we get to the airport and as the troops are entering the airport, what's quite clear is that the aircraft that we're seeing, many of these are not operational aircraft and probably haven't operated for many years. If you look at the tires on the aircraft, a lot of them are deflated. If we look at some of the hatches and things that are opened on the aircraft, they're lying open with signs of corrosion in the inside. If we look at the cockpits and the cockpit canopies that are opened, they are covered in dust. and in a way that these aircraft have probably not flown in quite a large number of years. And then some of them with parts stripped off. So it's clear that they've been used and cannibalized to provide parts for other working aircraft. I don't see much evidence, but we're only seeing a little bit of footage of serviceable aircraft. But it's significant the speed with which the rebel forces have managed to advance south, push the Syrian forces away, and the explosions that we're seeing, and some of them coming from the air, are either Syrian Air Force or Russian Air Force trying to slow the advance of the rebel forces down. We have to remember the primary support that Russia provides into the Syrian forces is Air Force support, air support, and we saw that before the ceasefire came in a few years back, where it was the Russians with the Syrians bombing the likes of Aleppo and elsewhere, and severe civilian casualties. But what we're seeing from the pictures coming out from the ground is this is not a well-equipped, well-maintained, properly deployed fighting Syrian force able to defend its positions, and that's why its defences are collapsing so fast at what seems to be a well-planned, well-equipped, concerted, light force attack by the rebel forces. And of course, Tartus is significant for the Med Fleet, and there have been reports this week of the Russians withdrawing their vessels from the Mediterranean Fleet base in Tartus, but the Russian response is that this was for a normal military exercise and military manoeuvres, which could be something that they do. It is manoeuvre season for the Russians. However, the Russians have released a very slick video showing some of the actions around these manoeuvres, and actually analysing the video. A lot of it is pre-staged, propaganda related. It's very slick. The military capability that's there is very clean, very tidy. The missiles are all working, and a lot of them are firing without no real understanding where they're going. There's no real camouflage around the equipments that are being used. The vessels that are being used, a lot of the video and the footage could have been filmed at any time. The aircraft that are flying over, again, could be filmed at any time, and it's unlikely that you'll get the aircraft support in for exercises whilst we've got the rebel forces advancing inside Syria. And therefore, I think this is something that the Russians are putting out to try and suggest to the Russian people, but more importantly to the international community, China in particular, Iran, and the wider BRICS community, that Russia is still an international player. I think Russia is in trouble in Syria, and Putin will be in a position where he's trying to work out whether he can afford to invest any more military capability into backing Bashar al-Assad, whether he can persuade Iran to step up and give more, or whether it's time to call quits. So thank you for watching this recap. Please remember, sign up for Times Radio membership, watch Frontline, and we'll see you again soon.